Okay, welcome everyone to the deep dive.
Hello.
Today, we're really getting into a massive story of political change. We're looking at Nepal,
Hmm.
specifically how a country with centuries of monarchy um, navigated some really turbulent times to become a federal democratic republic. It's quite the journey.
It really is a complex political odyssey, you could say.
Hmm.
And our plan for this deep dive, using the material provided, is to uh, pull out the core insights,
Right.
the key moments, the defining shifts that really shape things. We want to extract the essential threads for you, make sense of this, dramatic transformation.
So think of it as us sifting through the background info you've given us, finding the most important bits. We'll cover the timeline from, well, ancient dynasties and these hereditary rulers.
100%.
Exactly. Through revolution, civil war, and then up to the present day, looking at the republic and its ongoing challenges.
Let's start right at the beginning, set the scene.
Okay, so the material takes us way back before 1950, establishes the foundation. We have the Shah dynasty ruling from the mid-18th century.
That's the royal line, yeah. But what's really crucial, and the sources emphasize this, is that for a huge chunk of time, the real power wasn't exactly with the king.
Ah,
It was with the Rana family, an aristocratic group, totally separate from the royals, who effectively ran the show from 1846 right up to 1951. That's over 100 years.
wow, okay. And how did they manage that? The material mentions hereditary prime ministership.
Exactly.
Yeah.
The job of prime minister became hereditary within the Rana family. So it wasn't just a position, it was basically an oligarchy they established.
And the Shah king during all this?
Still the monarch, technically, but according to the sources, largely sidelined. More of a figurehead, really, while the Ranas held the actual power.
Got it.
Which brings us to, well, the first really big shift the material covers,
Mm-hmm.
the 1950 revolution.
Right. This sounds like the moment that Rana dominance finally gets challenged seriously. The sources mention King Tribhuvan playing a key role, and interestingly, support from India was important too.
Absolutely crucial, yeah. And the result was, well, seismic for Nepal. This revolution brought down the Rana oligarchy.
Okay.
It didn't get rid of the monarchy itself, though. Instead, it actually restored the Shah king's authority, put the crown back in a central power position after being pushed aside for so long.
And the material highlights this 1950 revolution as the dawn of parliamentary democracy in Nepal.
That's the term used, yeah,
Yeah.
the beginning of that idea. And following from that, a really key milestone mentioned is 1959.
The first general elections.
Exactly, leading to the first democratically elected government. So, a genuine shift seemed to be happening.
But knowing how these things often go, it probably wasn't a smooth ride from there.
Definitely not. The path was anything but straight. The material immediately describes the next phase as a pretty major step backward. We're talking about the Panchayat era.
Ah, okay. This is where that early experiment with democracy gets cut short.
Pretty much. The sources state that just a year after those 59 elections, so in 1960, King Mahendra, he dissolved the elected government, just like that.
Right, and then?
He introduced something called the Panchayat system. The material is quite clear in characterizing this. It was a partyless autocracy.
Partyless, meaning no political parties allowed.
Correct. Power was centralized very firmly under the monarchy. And this wasn't brief. It lasted from 1961 all the way through to 1990. 30 years.
And the impact of that? The material points to...
Political repression.
Yeah.
Limited civil liberties. That's
Yeah.
what the sources outline.
Okay.
So yeah, after that brief opening, the system clamped down and consolidated power right back under the king.
But these periods of tight control often lead to pushback eventually, right?
Almost inevitably, it seems. And the material details exactly that. The next big chapter is the 1990 People's Movement, known as Jana Andolan.
Jana and Dylan, okay. And this was driven by...
Mass protests,
Yeah.
widespread popular mobilization. And the sources name the key political players leading the charge, the Nepali Congress and the United Left Front.
So established political forces pushing back against the partyless system.
Exactly. And the pressure worked. It became immense. The material says it forced the king at the time, King Birendra, to concede.
How so?
He had to lift the ban on political parties. That ban had been the bedrock of the Panchayat system for 3 decades. Lifting it was huge.
Then the outcome?
Multi-party democracy was restored. And significantly, a new constitution came in 1990.
Okay.
This established Nepal as a constitutional monarchy. So the king's role changed again. He became more of a ceremonial head of state, not the absolute ruler he'd been under the Panchayat system. Power shifted back towards parliament.
So a return to a more democratic framework. But then the story takes another dark turn, doesn't it? The material introduces a period of intense conflict.
Yes, the timing is stark. Just as multi-party democracy is finding its feet again, we see the start of the Maoist insurgency, roughly 1996 to 2006, a full decade of conflict.
Where did this come from? The sources mention the Communist Party of Nepal, Maoist,
That's right, they launched what they called a People's War in 96.
and their reasons. What did the material say they were fighting for or against?
Well, the stated reasons, according to the sources, targeted really deep issues. Things like feudalism, social inequality, caste discrimination. They argued these needed revolutionary change.
And the impact of this war.
It wasn't small scale.
Hmm.
The conflict escalated dramatically. The material speaks of significant loss of life, widespread displacement across the country. It was a brutal period.
And in the middle of all this chaos, the king makes another move, King Gyanendra in 2005.
Yes, King Gyanendra, who had come to the throne after a tragic royal massacre.
Hmm.
In 2005, citing the instability in the insurgency, he dismissed the elected government.
Took direct control himself, echoes of his father, Mahendra, back in 1960.
Very much so. But what's really interesting, and the material highlights this, is the reaction. This move didn't actually quell the unrest or stabilize things.
No.
Quite the opposite. It seems to have backfired. The sources show it sparked even more widespread protests. And, crucially, it brought different opposition groups together against the monarchy's direct rule.
So that action kind of unintentionally paved the way for the next big shift.
It certainly looks that way. It set the stage for the final decisive push described in the material. The 2006 People's Movement, too.
Yeah.
And ultimately, the end of the monarchy itself.
People's Movement, too. Okay.
Yeah, another wave of massive protests erupted in 2006. And what made this one so powerful, according to the sources, was the coalition behind it.
Who was involved?
It was broad. You had the mainstream political parties, and you had the Maoists, the very group the state had been fighting for 10 years. They formed an alliance of sorts against the king's direct rule.
That must have been an incredibly powerful combination.
It proved irresistible. The material says they forced King Gyanendra to back down to reinstate the parliament he dissolved just the year before.
A major climb down for the monarchy.
Huge. And the momentum didn't stop there. The really irreversible change came just a couple of years later, in May 2008.
Which was?
The monarchy was formally abolished, centuries of rule finished. Nepal was officially declared a federal democratic republic.
Wow. The end of an era, truly. So the republic is established. What does the modern picture look like according to the material? It takes us from around 2015 onwards.
That's right. First, it highlights the new constitution promulgated in 2015. This came after years of, frankly, political wrangling and deadlock in the Constituent Assembly.
And this constitution laid out the framework for the new republic.
Yes, it established Nepal as a federal democratic republic, setting up a parliamentary system. It was meant to be the foundation for this new era.
But constitutions are often contentious. Was this one universally accepted?
Not at all. The material is very clear on this. It faced significant criticism right from the start, from several groups.
Like who?
The sources specifically mention Madhesi communities, primarily living in the southern plains, the Terai region.
And their issue was?
They felt marginalized by the new federal structure, the way the provincial boundaries were drawn. They argued it didn't adequately address their demands for representation and autonomy. There were major protests. And this points to a broader theme the material highlights about the period since 2015.
Which is?
A persistent pattern of political instability, frequent changes in government, difficulty forming lasting coalitions.
How frequent? Does the material give a sense of that?
It gives a pretty stark statistic, actually. As of 2024, so relatively recently, Nepal had apparently seen 14 different prime ministers just since the monarchy ended in 2008.
14 PMs in about 16 years.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That number really drives home the churn and the challenge of consolidating this new republican system. Finding stable governance has been tough.
Okay, so that covers the timeline. But the material also seems to pull back and look at some bigger overarching factors influencing all this.
It does, yeah. Two key ones are highlighted. First, geopolitics. You just can't ignore Nepal's location.
Sandwiched between India and China?
Exactly, two giants. And this position, the sources stress, has always profoundly shaped its foreign policy and often its internal politics, too.
How so?
Well, the material talks about the relationship with India complex, a mix of, deep ties, cooperation, but also tensions. Border disputes are even mentioned. And at the same time, it notes Nepal strengthening its relationship with China. The sources frame Nepal's foreign policy as this constant balancing act, trying to navigate between these two powerful neighbors to protect its sovereignty and also foster its own economic development. It's a delicate dance.
And the second major influence mentioned.
Social movements and the whole question of inclusion. This is a thread running through the entire history we've discussed.
Right. The material emphasizes that various movements have constantly pushed for the rights and recognition of marginalized communities.
Absolutely. It specifically names groups like the Medhisis, who we already mentioned, but also Tharu communities, various indigenous groups, all advocating for greater representation, for a fair share of power, for their identities to be respected within the state.
And the 2015 Constitution tried to address some of this.
It did, at least on paper. The material points to provisions like federalism itself and proportional representation systems as attempts to respond to these demands for inclusion. Though, as we saw with the Medhizi protests, the implementation and the specifics remain deeply contested.
So bringing it all together, the current situation as of 2024, how does the material summarize it?
It describes a very dynamic political environment. Still lots of vigorous debate happening
About
how governance should work best, how federalism is actually playing out on the ground, and these complex, ongoing questions of national identity in what is a very diverse country.
and the core challenges remain.
Pretty clear, yeah. Consolidating this relatively young democracy, trying to ensure economic development is inclusive, that it reaches everyone, and crucially managing that complex, diverse social fabric we've talked about, holding it all together.
It's really quite an incredible story when you lay it out like that.
It is. From the unique Rana system, through multiple revolutions, a really devastating civil war, and then the shift to a republic that's still, finding its way with federalism and dealing with this political instability. It's a lot packed into recent history.
You definitely get a sense of resilience, though, this constant push for change, even with all the setbacks.
Absolutely. But this history, as the material presents it, it really does make you stop and think, doesn't it? Given this recurring cycle, we've seen protest, big constitutional changes, followed by yet more instability. It raises a fundamental question, maybe for you listening to ponder.
Okay.
What do you think are the essential ingredients for a young republic like Nepal, with all its internal diversity and those huge geopolitical pressures we mentioned? What does it actually take to achieve lasting political stability and, importantly, truly inclusive governance for everyone?
That is definitely something to think about. A complex question with no easy answers, I suspect.
Indeed.
Well, thank you for walking us through that intricate history, and thank you all for joining us on this